A dear friend of mine from Cardwell is currently looking at a destroyed house, ruined books, letters, photographs, her memories of her life with her late husband, all ruined. She may or may not be able to go back to her house. She's most distressed about the impact on cassowaries and wallabies and the wildlife that surrounds her beautiful place in a now destroyed lowland rainforest. She's a victim, along with many others, of Cyclone Yasi. Well, as Peter said, can we link extreme weather like Cyclone Yasi or the terrible bushfires here and their impact, can we link that to climate change? Peter's given us a clue that the science is saying to us, in general, with climate change, with the pollution we're putting into our air, we will generally see the extremes become more extreme. Let me give you a couple of examples to paint that picture. Here's our own Bureau of Meteorology, one of our great institutions here in Australia, saying this 2 weeks ago. We've had severe tropical cyclones before, but the severity and the frequency of the weather we're experiencing this summer is in line with what you would expect if the atmosphere was warming, and that extra energy in that warmer atmosphere is driving these changes. Here's also our own CSIRO 3 years ago looking at bushfires and climate change in Southeast Australia. If we in the world don't act to tackle climate change, the percentage of days of extreme fire weather, the percentage of days of extreme risk could rise by up to 65% within 10 years, and by 2050 could rise by over 300% because of the projections in climate change. And they're saying that with a high degree of certainty. They're also saying that we should have a new class of fire days, catastrophic, because of the changing climate and the risks, if we don't act to get on top of greenhouse pollution, the risks of this escalating. Now, you can't pin all extreme weather onto climate change. Scientists won't do that, but there's enough evidence to say we should be really worried about this, and there's enough evidence to say we should be acting with great urgency. And Professor Garno is right. In this place 2 weeks ago, he said, if we don't act to tackle climate change, we ain't seen nothing yet with extreme climate events. We can choose to act. We can avoid the worst, and we can choose hope over despair. And today, in my time left, I actually want to focus on some good news and some opportunities. How do we grasp that opportunity that we still have and that our children won't have if we don't act? Here's some good news. Peter was right. The international negotiations in Cancun were very modest, but they did make some progress. For the first time, we've got all major countries around the world committing to targets about their emissions. It's not legally binding, and it's nowhere near enough. We need to be tracking towards a world where we're limiting warming not just to 2 degrees, but to below 1.5 degrees. we need to be reducing the carbon in the atmosphere down below 350 parts per million, the carbon equivalents. So it's a very modest step, but it is a step forward. And without steps forward, in no way can we build on the future that we need. Countries are taking action. I just noticed in The Guardian this week, in a report on China, they've noted this. China, with regard to its wind power generating capacity, has doubled every year for the last 4 years its wind power. And in 2010, last year, this became yet another field where China had surpassed the US to become number one. 7 of the planet's top 10 solar panel manufacturers are now Chinese. China's high-speed rail network, which was non-existent in 2008, will be bigger than the rest of the world combined within 2 years. And last year, China invested $34 billion, that's 3 times the profit that BHP Billiton announced yesterday. Last year, China invested $34 billion in clean technology compared to $18 billion in the US. They've passed it in investment terms. So countries are acting. They're not acting quick enough, they're not acting fast enough, but there's action there. Australia is still a laggard. Professor Garneau, once again a week ago, said Australia, Canada and the US are holding the world back. That's not good enough, but we have a unique opportunity to move this year. Our government, along with its minority supporters at the federal level, has said they are prepared to move. We have an opportunity to start building that bridge to a zero carbon emission future that we need. And we have to start that journey as quickly as possible. What can we do here in Australia at the national level? We urgently need a price on pollution. We urgently need to boost energy efficiency and renewable energies. We've got to get our pollution coming down. And I can report to you, with work that the Australian Conservation Foundation and the ACTU have done, we know with a price on carbon we can generate in the order of 3 million new jobs in Australia over the next 20 years, and with strong energy efficiency and renewable energy measures we can generate an additional 700,000 jobs. So we can tackle climate change, grow a clean economy and generate jobs. As a developed country, we've got more than most to lose from the impacts of climate change, and we've got a lot to gain if we act. As we help Australians struggle through floods, cyclones, bushfires, let's also recommit ourselves to hope and to an Australia urgently taking action to tackle climate change this year. Thank you very much. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much, Don Henry, Executive Director of the Australian Conservation Foundation. I remind you, Don, that $10 billion profit from BHP, that was a 6-monthly profit. So the annual profit, it might not be 3 times as much. More than half of the world's population now live in cities, and the proportion is growing. I think it's likely to be 2/3 by 2030 or something like that. And that means, of course, that the solutions to climate change are going to have to come from cities as well. And our next speaker is very well placed to talk about the role of cities in reducing carbon emissions and adapting to climate change. Cathy Oak is a councillor with the City of Melbourne, and she's been working on sustainability issues for more than 15 years. She's chair of the Future Melbourne Eco-City Committee, deputy chair of the Connected City Future Melbourne Committee, and co-chair of the Parks and Gardens Advisory Committee. And she also, Councillor Oak also represents the City of Melbourne on the International Executive Management Committee of ICLAI. That's the international movement of local governments for sustainability. Please welcome Councillor Oak.
You stole my first line. I was going to say that, but since you stole my first line, I can then use the short amount of time to actually, I'd like to... Oh, I'm getting signals. You want this down? Is that better? I would actually like to acknowledge Helen Sykes from Future Leaders and Jeff Taylor, who is... Oh, he's up the top. Kathy Alexander acknowledged that the Melbourne Conversations have been going for 10 years. And Jeffrey has been involved for all of that time, and as Kathy Alexander pointed out, it is his baby. And I would actually like us all to thank and congratulate Jeff Taylor on 10 years of putting together an amazing round of presentations. Obviously, and in partnership with Helen Sykes and Future Leaders, and many of you are on those databases, so let's thank Helen as well for your Future Leaders work. Yes, so as Peter said, cities are home to half of the world's population. Cities consume over 75% of the world's energy and account for more than 70% of global CO2 emissions. Cities, subnational governments will be responsible for 50 to 80% of the large-scale action needed to halve global emissions by 2050. And as the World Bank reported in December last year, 80% of the $80 to $100 billion per year in climate adaptation costs will be borne by cities too. Whether cities are developed or developing, though, they're not waiting. We are acting. We're already acting on climate change, and Don mentioned that countries are acting, cities are acting too. We're setting building codes, standards for ESD principles. We're retrofitting old commercial buildings and residential buildings. We're installing energy-efficient street lighting, sustainable transport solutions, installing state-of-the-art waste-to-energy systems, and many other examples. The City of Melbourne, as Kathy mentioned, has a zero net emissions policy by 2020. This includes targets to reduce emissions by 59% per worker and 30% per resident from 2006 levels. Our 1200 building program is a flagship element of this policy, and this plan is to retrofit 2/3 of our old commercial buildings by 2020. And this program, a first of its kind in Australia, will create 8,000 new jobs and generate $2 billion in private sector investment over the life of the program, and we expect it will also increase energy efficiency by almost 40%. And climate adaptation initiatives in Melbourne's parks and gardens include stormwater harvesting, water-sensitive urban design, development of landscapes and treescapes more suited to future climatic conditions. I also have a few other examples of other capital cities around Australia. In Darwin, their waste disposal site is the first renewable energy site in tropical Australia. It's a 1 megawatt power station powering 1,000 homes. Adelaide has a 200 kilowatt combined heat and power plant at their aquatic centre. Hobart has seen a 70% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from 96 levels using heat extraction from sewage effluent for its aquatic centre, concert hall and aged care facilities. And amongst many things, Sydney did instigate the City Switch program that we're involved in, and it's a great program where businesses help to become more efficient in their buildings in the city. And you might also have heard of the very controversial bike lanes that have been recently installed, but that was a very bold move on behalf of Clover Moore, the Lord Mayor in Sydney. And internationally, there are thousands of examples of cities acting as well. Copenhagen, yes, it is the city of bikes, and apparently 1 in 3 commuters are on bicycle, and they hope to make that 1 in 2. And they also hope to be the first national capital city that is carbon neutral by 2025. And one of the world's largest cities, Mexico City, has a very ambitious 15-year green plan costing $1 billion a year, or 8% of the council's budget, to make it one of the world's cleanest. They've increased their sustainable transport significantly, and they're going to close one of the largest landfill sites by the end of the year and use the methane gas to generate electricity. So huge costs and access to new technology present barriers to cities, though. Developing cities, we want to retrofit buildings, we want to adapt our buildings, and we want to use less or no dirty energy. Developing cities want to build smart, sustainable cities. So greater access to finance and greater dialogue with our national government is essential if cities are to act responsibly in the face of our huge contribution to CO2 emissions. And like many things in the environment world, and I was going to play the cooperation activity right now, but working together collaboratively to tackle large-scale issues is much more efficient and much more productive. But don't worry, I won't get you to stand up. But cities have a much louder voice and a much greater contribution to a climate-smart future if we act together. And the City of Melbourne is part of many, but two global city groups, the C40 Cities Initiative and ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, and we're the host city for the Oceania group of ICLEI. I mention all of this as a prelude as to why I was representing the City of Melbourne as part of a 4-person local government negotiation team at the last 2 UN conferences, the COP15 in Copenhagen and the COP16 in Cancun. The UNFCCC was devised for nations without recognition of local government as a governmental stakeholder. We've taken part in these events as observer, non-governmental stakeholders, and were mentioned as such in the official text. So ICLEI, United Cities and Local Government, Metropolis and many other global local government associations set up in Bali 2007 the Local Government Roadmap to COP15 in Copenhagen. The Local Government Roadmap was a call on national governments to include local actions and policies on the agenda of the Conference of the Parties, the COPs, and to strengthen the partnerships with local governments through their contributions and conference decisions, and importantly, to have us recognised as a governmental stakeholder within the official terminology. We came to the COPs to show that nations and cities around the world were already acting. And in most cases, they're actually reacting to the fact that their nations weren't acting. I'm getting the wind up, no. In the US, Mayor Nichols, the mayor of Seattle, he instigated the US mayor's climate protection agreement, and over 1,000 mayors have signed on to an agreement to reduce emissions as per Kyoto target for USA, which was 7% from the 1990 levels, something their federal government wasn't doing. Likewise, in Australia, 234 councils, representing over 84% of the Australian population, signed up to ICLEI's Cities for Climate Protection, and have adopted climate reduction targets greater than our current national level. In the lead up to Copenhagen, Cities Climate Catalogue was presented by the mayors to the COP15 president. It represented 3,000 cities around the world that had committed to reduce their carbon emissions, to show nations that cities are ready to help meet much needed targets. And we know that the globe was disappointed with what happened in Copenhagen, and on our small but pet topic of recognition, we were also let down in Copenhagen with no inclusion in the text. So in the lead up to Cancun last December, 140 cities representing more than 170 million people signed the Mexico City Pact, and that was presented to the president of the COP16. Why? To show not only that we set targets, like in the catalogue, but we're willing and ready to do so transparently with verifiable targets, something that nations are being asked to and requested to do so at the international level. And whilst the outcomes of Cancun, and I did meet Isabella and Don for the first time at the Moon Palace, at the Moon in Cancun, and I'm not sure if they agree, but whilst the outcomes at Cancun did feel very much like it was just taking the dodgy outcomes of Copenhagen and just putting it on a new set of letterhead, the pace was very slow, but we did get progress. And Isabella will mention a few more of the important outcomes of Cancun, and there were some. But importantly for us, for the first time, we do have text that acknowledges us, cities, as a key stakeholder and as a governmental partner. And to go back to my earlier remarks, in a global context, this recognition is really important for developing cities to have greater access to finance, technology, capacity building, etc. And it's important for Melbourne to be at these international events advocating on behalf of developing cities around the world. But in an Australian context, it's an analogous conversation that needs to be had in Australia, that partnering between all levels of government in Australia is needed to meet ambitious and necessary targets. Without appropriate recognition, empowerment, resourcing of local climate actions, it's impossible to sustain the future climate regime required given the predictions of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cathy Oak from the City of Melbourne. Well, we turn now from the city level to the national level, and particularly the relationship between developed and developing nations in relation to climate change. Of course, that's going to be crucial to any international progress and agreement on this issue, since poorer countries aren't going to cut their emissions if that means foregoing the benefits of economic growth and industrialisation that countries like Australia already enjoy. We're very lucky to have with us a leading international thinker in this area. Isabella Ratajczak-Jusko is an international relations specialist whose focus is on climate change and development. Originally from Poland, she's spent the past 6 years working with the Stockholm Environment Institute at the Oxford Centre on the European Capacity Building Initiative. And this is an initiative that aims to strengthen the relationship between climate change negotiators from the EU and from developing countries. And Isabella is now a research fellow in climate change adaptation with the Global Cities Research Institute at RMIT University. Isabella.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I must say that I'm really impressed. I'm still new to Melbourne, so I feel like a tourist. So every single action taken by Melburnians usually really inspire my new understanding of how beautiful this city is. And I wanted to acknowledge Cathy for her great achievement on behalf of cities in the climate regime, UN climate regime. From the international relations perspective, the UN climate regime meant to be a structure for nation states to be key decision makers. So as Cathy mentioned, it was extremely difficult, especially in Copenhagen, to actually acknowledge cities as part of the regime, but Cancun actually confirmed that this is possible. And this is to confirm as well a very new paradigm shift from this very top-down approach, UN to nation states and so on, to actually bottom-up. So we have communities at the very center, and then, perhaps this will help us establish our relation with the problem of climate change better. But I meant to talk about the Global Climate Fund, which I thought might be probably the brief description of the achievement of Cancun. And as Peter mentioned, Cancun, in his opinion, was not really a breakthrough. I think I would argue that, if you don't mind, Peter, that Cancun was a breakthrough in global political economy. For the very first time in our history, we actually managed to establish a global fund that will cover climate change actions in developing countries. Why in developing countries? Well, basically, the Convention on Climate Change is set on the equity principle, which is called CBDR. That's one of the acronyms. And let me just spell it out. It's called Common but Differentiated Responsibilities. So the convention actually divides countries into two groups, developed and developing countries. We can call them polluters and victims. So the first Global Climate Fund meant to deliver $100 billion annually by 2020 to support actions in most vulnerable countries. Australia actually made a statement in Cancun, which we all extremely appreciate, to pledge $15 million to the Adaptation Fund, bearing in mind some challenges of adaptation faced by nations in the Pacific, small island states. So leading to the next UN meeting, which will take place in Durban in South Africa this coming December, the great challenge of all nation states is to agree on steps forward, because the fund I just mentioned just only got established 2 months ago. And there's so much work to be done. You know, we need good guidelines. We need clear governance structure, acknowledging transparency, acknowledging accountability. And when I talk about accountability, I talk about accountability of governments and citizens. So what I mean by that is basically we all are together in the same boat, so we have to make sure that we are actually very well synchronized and the boat moves forward. And the reason why I'm actually making this comment is just behind us there is a beautiful river, Yarra, and I just recently joined the rowing team, and my team is actually now on the water, so I do apologize, but I just needed to acknowledge them. But I think it's a very good example. On the rowing boat, let's take 8-people boat. You have 8 rowers, and they all have their own responsibilities. So they have to synchronize their action in order to move forward without any possible disaster. And this leads to another outcome of Cancun, which is a topic of adaptation. The convention, set nearly 2 decades ago, set its very first objective as mitigation, which means to lower carbon emission. But years later, scientists proved that no matter what will be done, no matter how much we'll try to lower carbon emission, there are consequences that we all have to pay. So equally important is adaptation, which is a learning social process. So we have to learn to adapt to climate change, and at the same time, of course, we have to do our best to lower carbon emission, to avoid tragic consequences. And in order to do that, we need money, and that brings us to the issue of this new Green Climate Fund that got established. And I probably should wrap up now, and I'll be more than happy to answer some questions later. But I would like to leave this statement with 2 main points: that Cancun brings paradigm shift. It encourages all of us to think about low carbon societies. So the role of cities, the role of local government is extremely important. And how we basically mobilize finance for climate change also is quite important. So balance is probably the key word here. So we have to plan our actions in order to deliver effective adaptation and mitigation measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabella Rataitak-Jusko from the Global Cities Institute at RMIT, and a much more positive view of Cancun than I have generally heard, and throwing up some of those areas like adaptation and the Clean Climate Fund that perhaps haven't received a lot of attention. We're going to turn back now perhaps a bit more to the local situation and our own very contemporary debate about a price on carbon. Our final speaker is John Daly, who's the CEO of the Grattan Institute. It's an independent, rigorous and practical think tank focused on Australian domestic public policy. And the Grattan Institute has produced some very interesting research reports on carbon pricing and compensation. You'll find them on their website. The Grattan Institute was created in 2008 with an endowment that was provided by the federal and Victorian governments, the University of Melbourne and BHP Billiton. And John himself has 20 years' experience spanning policy, academic, government and corporate roles at Melbourne and Oxford universities, the Victorian Government, the Department of Justice, the consulting firm McKinsey & Co, and with the ANZ Bank. Please welcome John Daly.
Good evening, everyone, and if I can add my thanks to the Melbourne City Council and also to the Future Leaders Forum for putting on this event in this quite extraordinary, wonderful venue, which I think Melbourne is going to treasure for many years to come. As Peter said, I'm going to bring us back locally, and I want to cover three things. Firstly, just to talk about why it is important that we put a price on carbon. Secondly, to talk about why it is that we can afford to do that. And finally, to talk about some of the big questions that as a political community we're going to have to settle over the next 6-8 months or so, and to give you an idea about what those questions are and what might be good ways of resolving them. So firstly, why is it so important to put a price on carbon? Why is it that economists get so excited about this? Well, the answer is because economists have discovered the hard way over the last 200, 300 years that if you are serious about something, by and large, you have to price it. Economists get very excited when you price things because it means that things start to happen efficiently. Now, that might sound like really boring stuff that only accountants care about, but when we do things efficiently as a community, we have more money left over for hospitals, for schools, for the arts, for building places like this. And if we try and reduce our carbon emissions inefficiently, there is no question it will be very, very expensive. And it will mean that we can't do other things. So that's why, first of all, we need a price, because it enables markets to do their thing. Now, one of the catches with that, in terms of the popular imagination, is that markets are boring. The invisible hand is invisible. You can't see anything happening. But the advantage of markets, the advantage of prices, is that they enable a huge number of little decisions that collectively have a very big impact to happen without government trying to mandate every single one of them, and as a result we get very significant change in how our society works efficiently. If you actually look at the history of other measures to reduce pollution, which is a piece of work that Grattan Institute released late last year, there's a really interesting pattern. We looked at about 8 different schemes, and the same thing happened about 8 times. Essentially, the price that was forecast before the scheme went into operation actually turned out to be a lot higher than the price that actually happened once the scheme started running. And that, of course, is actually good news. It means that it was substantially cheaper to reduce pollution than everybody expected once there was a price on pollution. And that's not an accident. As soon as you give people an incentive to innovate, strangely enough, they do, and strangely they tend to innovate at costs much less than whatever it is that it costs today. So that piece of work suggests if we put a price on carbon, ironically, happy surprises are likely. Over a period of time, it is likely that we will find much cheaper ways of reducing carbon emissions than we currently know about. The second question I wanted to talk about, after talking about why we should put a price on carbon at all, is to talk about whether we can afford it as a community. As individuals, and for most businesses, the net impact of a price on carbon of around $35, which is actually more than people are talking about, at least in the short term, will be about 1%. That's roughly similar to the impact of the GST. Now, if you effectively have to reduce your take-home income by about 1% next year, that is obviously something that's quite serious. Obviously, we all hope that our economy will continue to grow, and if it continues to grow at the sort of rate it has been over the last decade, it will grow by about 1.5% to 2% per person. And so, in fact, you'll take home a little bit more than you did last year, but not as much if there were no price on carbon. That's because it's going to cost real money to reduce emissions, and there won't be more power to show for it. Our power is essentially going to be more expensive. But my point is that 1% is frankly something that we can probably all afford. Australia now has one of the highest standards of living in the world. It has the highest carbon emissions per capita in the developed world. Frankly, we can afford it, and it's simply going to have to be the price that we all pay collectively. I think we all need to look that clearly in the face and admit that, yes, it's going to be more expensive, but we, as individuals, as small businesses, as most businesses, can afford it. And as I said, across the economy, it's going to be about 1% of costs. Now, of course, there are a bunch of industries that emit a lot and that compete internationally, which in the carbon pricing trade are known as ETs. Again, this is something that Grattan Institute has done some work on, and the evidence is very clear. For most of those industries, there is no question that they will be significantly less profitable. Not surprisingly, their leaders are not very happy about that. And not surprisingly, their leaders are doing everything they can to lobby the government so that they wind up paying less. And if I were running one of those companies, I would be doing the same. That is my obligation to shareholders, amongst many other things. But it's not the obligation of government to necessarily do whatever they are asked. And as I said, the evidence we went through, literally going down and looking at it at a plant-by-plant level for most of the major emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries in Australia. The evidence is that these companies and these plants will continue to be very competitive against the rest of the world. They'll just be less profitable than they are at the moment. And that is true of alumina refining, coal extraction and LNG. And one of the most egregious things about the payments that government was proposing was that they were proposing to pay transitional assistance to LNG plants that hadn't even been built yet. So we can afford it. There are without doubt a couple of industries which are in some trouble, particularly cement and steel, but we don't have to deal with this problem by simply handing them money. We are much better off to do it with import adjustments that essentially mean that these industries continue to have significant incentives to reduce their emissions. And the worst vice of the compensation payments that have been proposed is that they substantially reduce the incentives for these emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries to reduce their emissions. And given that they are 30%, 30%, of Australia's total emissions, they matter in the scheme of things. And because the compensation permits or transitional payment permits or whatever you want to call them were at such a high level, and because there was a so-called no windfall gains provision which essentially was designed to stop some of these companies actually profiting from a carbon trading scheme because the government figured out that that was not a good look, many of these plants would have wound up with relatively little incentive to substantially reduce their emissions, and as I said, that's a problem when they're 30% of the show. So, we need a price on carbon. As a community, we can afford to put a price on carbon. What are the things that we're going to have to deal with over the next 6 or 8 months? And again, some of this looks pretty boring, and some of it looks like the kind of stuff that only policy wonks like me care about. But the problem is that if it's only a conversation between policy wonks, then frankly vested interests will win, and we will wind up with a scheme and a price on carbon which is much less effective than it might be otherwise. So what are some of the issues? The first issue is, what price should we put on carbon in the first place? As you will probably know, the Australian government is talking about putting a tax in place to start with. And there's a bunch of reasons why that's actually not a bad move. I would suggest that that tax needs to be at least $20 to $25. And the fundamental reason for that is, unless it is that high, we will not see new gas-fired power stations built. Instead, we will simply see extensions to existing coal-fired power stations, or worse still, new coal-fired power stations. The whole point of putting a price on carbon is that we get transformation in our economy, and the largest single change that we will get in the short term, not the long term, but in the short term, is a shift from coal-fired electricity generation to gas-fired electricity generation. That shift roughly halves the emissions from electricity. So it matters. It's a big deal. And consequently, that's why we need a price in that kind of order of $20 to $25, because that's the point at which the economics work in terms of starting to build significantly more in the way of baseload gas-fired power stations. The second big issue is something I've already talked about a little, and that is the issue of compensation, as it's often termed by the industry, although why they should be compensated for a change which has been on the cards officially at least since 1991, that's 20 years ago, for those of you who are a little slow at the maths. And when I was actually at university studying maths and chemistry in 1987, we were talking in our classes about the greenhouse effect, about the impact that would have on climate. This is not news. So why companies should be compensated for a well-known environmental measure is somewhat beyond me. Secondly, there is an issue about, they're currently described by the government as transition payments. Frankly, it's not entirely clear to me what we are transitioning from or to. We, at the moment, have an economy which doesn't have a price on carbon. We're moving to a situation in which there will be a price on carbon. In that sense, there's a transition. But again, why companies should be paid to make that transition, by and large, is a little beyond me. And then finally, there's a question which is about how we move from the carbon tax that's being proposed now to a fully fledged cap and trade scheme at some point in the future, perhaps 3, 5, 7 years from today. I would suggest it's very important that we think long and hard now about how we manage that shift, because one of the best ways to do it would be to say that when we make that shift, we will keep the tax in place. The consequence will be that if you emit a tonne of carbon, you've got to do two things. You have to pay a tax and you have to buy a permit. The consequence of that is that the tax will act as a floor price. It provides certainty to those who are thinking about building, for example, power stations, those who are thinking about investing significant sums of capital in reducing their emissions, provides those people with certainty that they can make their investment and it will pay off. That's the value and virtue of a floor price. And then the value and virtue of a trading scheme on top of that is that it enables, in particular, governments to understand what is the real supply and demand for carbon out there. How hard is it really for industry to reduce its emissions? Because, of course, when you ask industry how hard it's going to be to reduce its emissions, invariably you get the answer, very difficult indeed. And by and large, based on whatever we know about exactly today and what's exactly in place today, that's true. But as I said right up at the beginning, one of the things that we know from the history of these schemes is that as soon as there is a real live economic incentive in place, people will innovate and the price will come down. And the virtue of a real cap and trade scheme is that it enables government to really understand just how hard it is, in fact, being in practice to reduce emissions so that we can set policy accordingly. Those were the things I was hoping to cover tonight. Thank you again for the opportunity. And as I said, I'd like you to remember three things. Firstly, we need a price on carbon. It will make a big difference. Secondly, we as a community and as Australians and as Australian industry can afford it. And thirdly, there's a bunch of design questions that might be a little bit dull, but nevertheless are extremely important, and we need to get them right over the next 6 months. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John Daly, CEO of the Grattan Institute.